In the early 1900s, Russia was ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, who was an absolute monarch. While there was a parliament in Russia, it had no real power. Society was deeply divided, with nobles at the top, peasants at the bottom, and the middle class in between. Most people were peasants and lived in poverty. Many worked on farms and used outdated agricultural machines and methods. Industrialization was also lacking, causing the economy to struggle. The high cost of goods made life even harder for common people, leading to the spread of revolutionary ideas. When World War I began, Russia joined the war as they were the self-proclaimed protector of the Serbs, defending Serbia against Austria-Hungary. The Russian government believed its alliances would keep it strong. However, the war quickly turned into a disaster. In 1914, at the Battle of Tannenberg, Russian forces suffered a massive defeat due to poor planning and lack of supplies. While the Russian army was large, it was poorly trained and very badly equipped. As more men were drafted, farms and factories lost workers, leading to food shortages. This was a vicious cycle that ended up collapsing the Russian economy. Due to this, prices soared and hunger spread, making life unbearable for civilian peasants. World War I was not just a battle with many casualties, it was a long war of attrition. This was mainly due to trench warfare. Many soldiers didn't die from gunfire, but from disease, sickness, and starvation. Because of this, trench warfare made battles long and deadly. New weapons, such as machine guns and poison gas, only worsened the horrors. In 1915, Tsar Nicholas II made a horrible mistake by taking direct control of the army despite not being a skilled military leader. This caused him to lose public trust. Meanwhile, in the capital, a so-called holy man named Rasputin gained influence over the royal family by acting as a healer for the queen's son. His presence and power led to many protests and strikes. In February 1917, massive protests erupt, forcing Tsar Nicholas II to step down. A new provisional government took power, but it struggled to maintain control. Russia was still involved in World War I, and the people, tired of war and poverty, demanded change. The instability led to the October Revolution. During this, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power and promised peace, land, and bread to gain public support. The Bolsheviks immediately started dismantling the old order. Much of the private land was seized and redistributed to peasants, factories were overtaken by workers, and Russia began its transformation into a socialist state. Soon after, a brutal civil war erupted between the Bolsheviks' Red Army and the opposing White Army, led by all its soldiers of the Tsar, monarchists, capitalists, and other anti-Bolshevik factions. The war brought even more suffering to Russia as famine, disease, and violence spread across the land. Eventually, the Bolsheviks crushed their enemies and secured power. In 1918, with their rule solidified, the Bolsheviks made a controversial move. They signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, officially withdrawing from World War I. However, this came at a large price. Russia was forced to give up vast amounts of land. This included present-day Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. They had to give this to Germany and its allies. This loss further weakened Russia's international standing. Despite this, the Bolsheviks pressed forward with their new vision. In 1922, they restructured the fragmented remnants of the Russian Empire into a new state, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a communist regime led by Lenin, and then they produced this banger. With Lenin as its leader, the Soviet Union embraced communism, aiming to build a society where the working class ruled. However, there were still challenges. Lenin died in 1924, and a power struggle emerged, ultimately leading to Joseph Stalin rising to power. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union industrialized rapidly, but at a great cost to human welfare. Forced labor camps, political purges, and widespread repression became defining aspects of Soviet rule. On the world stage, Russia's withdrawal from the war and its communist revolution led to deep distrust from Western nations. The Soviet government was excluded from the Treaty of Versailles, the very agreement that shaped the post-war world. While Britain, France, and the United States determined the fate of defeated nations, the Soviet Union was left out, further isolating it from global politics. Western powers viewed the new communist state as a threat, setting up the coming decades of tension. Despite its isolation, the Soviet Union focused on rebuilding itself under communist rule. Its revolutionary ideas spread worldwide, fueling future conflicts like the Cold War. Russia's experience in World War I and the revolutions that followed changed its course, transforming it from an old empire into a new communist state that would shape the 20th century. During World War I, the Russian Empire was in a state of political unrest. People were dissatisfied with the rule of Tsar Nicholas II, and they wanted something better. All of this boiled over one day in March of 1917. It was Women's Day, and a bunch of working-class women in the city of Petrograd were tired with the food shortages and rationing that was happening. Naturally, they started strikes, protesting against the injustice. This spread to more ears. Of course, the government didn't like this, so they sent soldiers to quell the unrest. These soldiers refused to fire on the protesters, however. They started a mutiny and joined the opposition themselves. In addition, the Russian Empire's elected legislative assembly, known as the Duma, refused to dissolve, like before, and also grew in opposition against the Tsar. As this ordeal escalated, it reached Tsar Nicholas himself. He was facing all kinds of pressure from people everywhere, and had no choice but to step down and abdicate the throne, ending the long-running Romanov dynasty. This was known as the February Revolution because it took place in February as per the Julian calendar, despite actually taking place in March per our now standardized Gregorian calendar. The Tsar and his family were later brutally executed by firing squad and stabbing with bayonets. After the Tsar stepped down, the Duma took charge, establishing the provisional government. This government didn't address the political issues of the country and made a controversial decision to continue fighting in the war. Meanwhile, Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky began to collect support for the Bolsheviks, a faction of a Marxist party known as the Russian Social Democrats. He rallied the people with promises of peace, land, bread, and worker control of production. In November of the same year, the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace and seized power from the provisional government, which quickly collapsed without much bloodshed. Outwardly, Lenin transferred power to the Congress of Soviets, who happened to be meeting that day, but the real power stayed with Lenin and his council. One of Lenin's first objectives was to deliver peace, as he had promised, and so he made negotiations and signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March of 1918. Many people were not happy about the new communist regime, however, including the Allied powers who wanted Russia back in the war. Because of this, Russia soon erupted into a brutal civil war with two distinct sides: the Red Army, who were the Bolsheviks and their supporters, and the White Army, which consisted of the various other political groups in the country. The Allies supported the White Army, sending a few troops over but mostly providing material aid to them. The White Army put up a fight, but were ultimately crushed by the Communists, as the Bolsheviks were now called. Their success could be attributed to a couple of different things. First of all, the Communists were united in cause and had a well-disciplined fighting force led by Trotsky himself, who was the Commissar of War. Second, they appealed to Russian patriotism against foreign armies who were stationed on Russian soil. In addition, the Communists began violent elimination of their opposition. The Communist secret police, the Cheka, led mass executions and slaughter of many people who disliked the regime. This was justified as necessary to consolidate power. Now that the White Army was put down, the Communists had full control of Russia. They formed the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the RSFSR, and later made a treaty in 1922 with the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the SSR, the Byelorussian SSR, and the Transcaucasian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, or the SFSR. Together, they formed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, the Soviet Union. Up until now, Leon Trotsky was thought to be the next to take power after Lenin's death. Joseph Stalin, however, began to grow in popularity. He had played important background roles in the October Revolution and the Civil War, and now became more prominent than Trotsky, sliding with 4 people and taking power over them. He expelled Trotsky from the country and even had him assassinated in 1940. With no one left to challenge him, Stalin took power and became the new dictator. With Stalin in power, the Soviet Union entered a new chapter defined by dictatorship. It became a major world power that set the stage for decades of global tension. Russia had a huge army, but they were not well equipped. This was mainly because all of their resources in their country were so spread out, and their industrial base was underdeveloped compared to other major powers. Many of the soldiers, especially early in the war, were sent to the front without a rifle and were told to pick one up from a fallen comrade if needed. This was not common throughout the entire war, but did occur during the war's shortages. The weapons that they used were often old or not produced in sufficient numbers to meet demands. The standard-issue troop rifle, the Mosin Nagant rifle, was a bolt-action rifle known for its reliability and accuracy. However, Russia didn't have enough of these early in the war, and although it was a solid rifle, it wasn't as advanced as some newer models used by German forces, such as the Gewehr 98. Another gun that the Russian army had was the Maxim machine gun, developed by Hiram Maxim in 1884. This was one of the first fully automatic machine guns, and it was used by many armies in World War I. Russia used a variant called the PM-M1910, which was mounted on a wheeled cart with a protective shield and was water-cooled, making it effective for sustained fire in defensive positions. Artillery also had a big effect on the war. Howitzers and cannons were used for long-range engagement, both offensive and defensive. Mortars also found their use, as they were very effective in trench warfare. They were used for close-range bombardment and could arc shells directly into enemy trenches, bypassing barriers and defenses. Chemical warfare was introduced as a way to combat trench warfare. This was a devastating weapon for soldiers to experience the effects of, as though sleeping would suffocate from inhaling the gas. Gases like chlorine and phosgene attacked the respiratory system, causing chemical burns in the lungs and leading to pulmonary edema, where fluid filled the lungs, and often resulted in death by suffocation.
Dumb ways to die. So many dumb ways to die. Dumb ways to die. So many dumb ways to die.
Since the gas is denser than air, it would also settle into trenches, making them especially dangerous. World War I was the first war to include aircraft and dogfights. At first, planes were just used for reconnaissance, however, their use soon expanded. They started to carry bombs to bomb enemy trenches. As planes started filling the battlefield sky, so did the need for firepower in the sky to oppose these planes. As such, many armies also installed machine guns on their planes. Some of the planes that Russia used were the Sikorsky Ilya Muromets heavy bomber, one of the first of its kind, the Anicha reconnaissance plane, and the Sikorsky S-16 fighter, which is among the earliest Russian-designed fighter aircraft. Russia used trench warfare, a common practice of many other nations during World War I. This made warfare very long and caused many casualties, though not all by gunshot. In fact, most of these deaths were due to illness and injuries from being in a trench for so long, including exposure to the cold, trench foot or damage to the foot caused by standing in cold wet mud, and infections from unsanitary conditions. Soldiers were often stuck in a stalemate, with opposing sides dug in and separated by a strip of land, often called no man's land, which made direct assaults deadly and ineffective and prompted the rise of aerial warfare, which was not limited to the constraints of the ground. Russia's role in World War I was mainly a tragedy. Their army, although massive, struggled with supply issues, outdated technology, and disorganization. Despite these challenges, army leaders like General Alexei Brusilov led some of the most effective offensives of the war, most notably the Brusilov Offensive, which dealt a serious blow to Austro-Hungarian forces. However, even with moments of success, the Russian military suffered heavy losses. Nikolai Ruski held high command in the early years of the war and played a role in the Russian advance into Galicia, but his leadership was also criticized and he was later removed from command. Paul von Rennenkampf's defeat at the Battle of Tannenberg was one of the early major disasters for the Russian army. It exposed serious flaws in communication and coordination among Russian commanders. All these highlight how complex and challenging the war was for Russia. As the war dragged on, morale dropped, and tensions at home grew worse. Russia's involvement in World War I shaped its military and its society. The use of trench warfare, chemical weapons, and aerial combat redefined modern warfare. What began as a war between empires turned into a global conflict that changed how war was fought, and Russia's struggles on the battlefield played a key role in that transformation.